The fluorescent lights in the music room hummed with a low, annoying buzz that seemed to match the nervous energy in the air. It was a Tuesday afternoon, late enough that the sun was starting to go down, casting long, dark shadows across the schoolyard outside. But inside the small, windowless practice room, the light was harsh and bright. This was the day of the annual evaluations. For the students, it was the one day a year that mattered more than any other. It was the day they found out if they had what it took to be a real musician, or if they were just wasting their time and their parents' money. Mrs. Sterling sat at the front of the room. She was an older woman with steel-gray hair pulled back into a tight bun that looked painful. She wore a stiff blazer, even though the room was stuffy, and she held a clipboard with a pen that she tapped rhythmically against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. Mrs. Sterling had a reputation in the community. She was known as the teacher who could turn a clumsy child into a concert pianist. But she was also known for being ruthless. She didn't believe in coddling. She didn't believe in fun music lessons. She believed in discipline, perfection, and fear. Sitting on the hard wooden bench in the corner was 7-year-old Sophie. Her feet dangled about 6 inches off the floor, swinging slightly back and forth because she couldn't reach the pedals. She was wearing her favorite blue dress, the one with the small flowers on the collar. Because her mother had told her to look nice for Mrs. Sterling, she had spent the entire week practicing her scales, her fingers moving over the keys at home until they were sore. She wanted to impress the teacher. She wanted to hear Mrs. Sterling say she was good, but as Sophie looked around the room, her stomach started to hurt. The other students were older, 10, 11, 12 years old. They looked confident. They sat with their backs straight, their sheet music organized neatly in black folders. They were whispering to each other, ignoring Sophie. She felt very small and very out of place. Next, Mrs. Sterling barked out, not looking up from her clipboard. The sound made Sophie jump. A boy named Thomas, who was 11 and had already won 2 local competitions, walked up to the grand piano in the center of the room. He sat down, cracked his knuckles, and launched into a complicated piece that sounded like a storm. Sophie watched his fingers fly. They were fast and strong. When he finished, Mrs. Sterling didn't smile, but she nodded her head. It was a small nod, but it meant approval. Technique is acceptable, Thomas. Your timing was slightly off in the second measure, but it will do, she said in a dry voice. Thomas beamed anyway and walked back to his seat, chest puffed out. Finally, Mrs. Sterling looked over the rim of her glasses. Her eyes landed on Sophie. Sophie, she said, "Come here." The room went quiet. The older students stopped whispering. All eyes turned to the little girl in the blue dress. Sophie took a deep breath, wiped her sweaty palms on her dress, and slid off the bench. She walked to the piano. It felt like walking to the principal's office. The piano was enormous. It was shiny and black and seemed to glare down at her. She climbed up onto the bench and positioned herself. She couldn't reach the floor, so she had to balance carefully just to stay upright. "Play your C major scale," Mrs. Sterling commanded, "and then the piece I assigned you." Sophie nodded. She placed her right hand on the keys. Her fingers were small and chubby, a child's fingers. She pressed down. C, D, E, F, G. She focused hard. She wanted to be perfect. But as she reached the top of the scale, her pinky finger slipped. She hit a wrong note. It wasn't a loud mistake, but to Sophie, it sounded like a crash of thunder in a library. She froze for a split second, then corrected herself and finished the scale. She didn't wait for instruction. She started her piece. It was a simple folk song, something meant for beginners. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. It was a song that every child knew, but Sophie tried to play it with feeling. She tried to put a little bit of softness into the notes, but she was nervous. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her playing sounded stiff and jerky. She missed another note halfway through. Suddenly, the sound of a hand slapping down on the piano stopped her cold. Mrs. Sterling had reached out and hit the wood of the piano lid. "Stop," Mrs. Sterling said. "Just stop." Sophie pulled her hands back into her lap, as if she had touched a hot stove. She looked at the teacher, her eyes wide and filling with tears. Mrs. Sterling took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, letting out a long, suffering sigh. "Sophie," she said, her voice filled with a disappointment that was worse than yelling. "How long have you been taking lessons now?" 6 months, ma'am," Sophie whispered. 6 months, Mrs. Sterling repeated. She looked around the room at the other students. "And this is what you have to show for it?" She turned back to Sophie. "Your posture is slumped. You look like a sack of potatoes on that bench. Your fingers are weak. They lack strength. You are pressing the keys like they are afraid of you." A few of the older students giggled. One boy covered his mouth to hide a laugh. Sophie felt her face get hot. It felt like her skin was on fire. She wanted to run out of the room, but she was frozen to the spot. "I practiced," Sophie stammered, her voice shaking. "Practicing isn't enough if you don't have the talent to back it up," Mrs. Sterling said sharply. She picked up her pen and made a big, angry mark on her clipboard. "Music requires discipline, Sophie. It requires a natural ability that you clearly do not possess. Listening to you play is painful. It is noise. It is not music." The words hit Sophie like a physical blow. Not music. Noise. Mrs. Sterling stood up. She walked over to Sophie and looked down at her. "Look at your hands," she said. Sophie looked at her small hands. "They are too small. They are too slow. You struggle with the simplest concepts. I told your father when he signed you up that I didn't teach babies, but he insisted. I should have trusted my instincts." Mrs. Sterling waved her hand toward the door, shooing Sophie away like a fly. "Go sit down. I can't bear to listen to any more. I am going to write a note to your parents. I think it would be best for everyone if you stopped taking lessons. You are taking up time and resources that could be used on students who actually have a future." Sophie didn't remember sliding off the bench. She didn't remember walking back to her corner. One moment she was sitting in the spotlight of humiliation, and the next, she was back on the small wooden chair, hugging her knees to her chest. The tears were streaming down her face now, hot and fast, but she made no sound. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of hearing her cry. The room was buzzing again. The other students were whispering, not even trying to hide it anymore. "Did you hear that?" "She got kicked out," one girl whispered. "I knew she wasn't good." "She's just a little kid," another student snickered. "My little sister plays better than that," a boy laughed from the back row. Sophie buried her face in her knees. She felt small. She felt worthless. Mrs. Sterling went back to her clipboard, acting as if Sophie didn't even exist. The teacher called the next student, a tall girl with long fingers, and the beautiful, complex music started again. But Sophie couldn't hear the beauty anymore. She only heard the words repeating in her head over and over, like a bad record that wouldn't stop skipping. Asterisk, you are weak. You have no talent. It is just noise. Asterisk. Sophie sat in the corner for the rest of the hour, listening to the others play, feeling the heavy weight of Mrs. Sterling's judgment pressing down on her chest. The fluorescent light kept buzzing, indifferent to her pain. When the lesson was finally over, Mrs. Sterling dismissed the class without a second glance at the little girl in the blue dress. Sophie packed her bag slowly, her hands trembling, and walked out into the cold evening air, believing with all her heart that she would never touch a piano key again. The walk home felt longer than usual. The autumn wind was cold, cutting through Sophie's thin jacket, but she barely noticed the chill. The numbness inside her was worse than any wind. She kept her head down, watching her scuffed shoes scuff against the sidewalk pavement, kicking at a stray pebble every few steps. The words from the music room kept replaying in her mind, echoing louder with every step. Asterisk weak. No talent. Noise. They stung just as much now as they had when Mrs. Sterling first said them. When she finally pushed open the front door, the smell of dinner greeted her. It was a warm, comforting smell of roasted chicken and spices, usually something that would make her stomach growl. Today, it just made her feel sick. Her mother was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she stirred a pot on the stove. "How did it go, sweetie?" her mother asked, turning around with a bright smile. Did Mrs. Sterling like the song? Sophie stopped in the doorway. She couldn't look her mother in the eye. She felt the tears threatening to spill over again. It's just like they had in the music room, but she swallowed hard to push them down. She didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to see the look on her mother's face when she told her that the 6 months of driving her to lessons, the money spent on books, and the time spent listening to her practice had all been for nothing. Okay, Sophie mumbled, lying in a voice so quiet it was barely a whisper. She didn't wait for a reply. She dropped her backpack on the floor and hurried down the hallway to her bedroom, closing the door firmly behind her. For the next 3 days, the piano in the living room sat silent. It was a large, upright piano that had been in the family for years. Its wood was scratched, and some of the keys had a yellowish tint to them, but it had always been a happy place for Sophie. Now, every time she walked past it, on her way to the kitchen or bathroom, she felt like it was staring at her. It looked like a giant, mute monster, reminding her of her failure. She avoided it like it was contagious. She stopped going to her room. She stopped playing with her toys. She mostly sat on the living room sofa, staring blankly at the television, not really watching anything. Her parents worried, but they didn't push her. They thought she was just tired, or maybe getting sick. They brought her soup and juice, patting her head gently, which only made her feel guiltier. She felt like a disappointment to everyone. On the 4th night, the house was incredibly quiet. It was past midnight. Her parents had gone to bed hours ago. The only sound was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional creak of the house settling. Sophie couldn't sleep. She had tossed and turned, her sheets tangled around her legs, her mind racing with frustration. She wasn't just sad anymore. She was angry. She was angry at Mrs. Sterling for being so mean, but she was also angry at herself. Was the teacher right? Was she really just noise? She climbed out of bed and walked slowly into the living room. The moon was shining through the curtains, casting long, silvery shadows across the floor. The piano sat there in the corner, bathed in the pale light. Sophie walked up to it. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the fallboard that covered the keys. Taking a deep breath, she pulled it back. The keys stared back at her, white and black rows of possibilities. She sat down on the bench. It was cold. Her feet dangled, just as they had in the classroom. She stared at her hands in the moonlight. They were small hands, childish hands. Mrs. Sterling had said they were too weak. Sophie balled her hands into fists, squeezing them tight until her knuckles turned white. Then she relaxed them. She didn't want to play the C major scale. She never wanted to play that scale again. It didn't mean anything to her. It was just an exercise. Instead, she thought about a movie she and her dad had watched a few weeks ago. It was an old black and white movie about a pianist who lost his hearing but kept playing. There was a song in that movie, a song that was fast and loud and full of emotion. It wasn't a beginner song. It was a song that sounded like rain falling on a tin roof, then like thunder crashing, and then like birds singing after the storm. Sophie closed her eyes. She could hear the melody in her head. It started high up, near the right side of the keyboard. She lifted her right hand and struck a key. Then another. It wasn't perfect. Her memory wasn't perfect, but she could feel the shape of the music. Mrs. Sterling had told her to read the notes on the paper, to follow the rules, to be precise. But Sophie realized she didn't care about the rules right now. She just wanted to let the sound out. She began to play. At first, her fingers were stiff and unsure. They tripped over the keys. But then, something strange happened. As she focused on the feeling of the song in her head, her fingers seemed to know where to go. She wasn't looking at notes. She wasn't thinking about her posture. She was just playing. She missed a note, but instead of stopping, she just hit the next one harder. It sounded okay. It sounded like her. She started to get lost in it. The living room disappeared. The image of Mrs. Sterling's stern face faded away. There was only the vibration of the strings under her fingers. She played the loud parts with her whole arm, slamming the keys with a force she didn't know she had. Mrs. Sterling had said her fingers were weak. But right now they didn't feel weak. They felt powerful. The piano shook slightly with the force of her playing. When the song got to the quiet, Sad part in the middle. Sophie slowed down. She pressed the keys gently, creating a soft, haunting sound that hung in the air like fog. She realized she was swaying back and forth, moving with the rhythm naturally. No one had taught her to do that. It just happened. She wasn't playing hot cross buns. She wasn't playing the boring songs from the lesson book. She was playing something much bigger. It was messy. It was full of wrong notes and broken timing, but it was real. She played for an hour. Her fingers began to ache, but she didn't want to stop. For the first time in days, the knot in her chest began to loosen. The tears that she had been holding back finally came, but they weren't tears of shame. She was crying because the music was so beautiful and because it was coming out of her. The girl who had no talent, the girl who was just noise, finally exhausted, she let her hands drop into her lap. The last note faded away into the silence of the house. Sophie sat there in the dark, listening to the quiet. She felt her heart beating fast, not from fear this time, but from excitement. She looked down at her hands in the moonlight. They were the same small hands as before. But they didn't look useless anymore. Mrs. Sterling had said she needed discipline to be a musician. Sophie realized that night that she didn't need discipline. She needed passion. She climbed off the bench and walked back to her room, but she didn't feel like a failure anymore. She felt like she had a secret. She had a fire inside her that Mrs. Sterling couldn't see. And maybe, just maybe, one day she would be able to show it to the world. The days following that secret night in the living room were different for Sophie. The heavy cloud of sadness that had hung over her seemed to have lifted slightly. The humiliation from Mrs. Sterling's words was still there, tucked away in the back of her mind, but it no longer paralyzed her. Instead, she felt a quiet burn in her chest, like a tiny pilot light that had been turned on. Every day after school, instead of watching television, she went straight to the piano. She didn't play her scales. She didn't play the nursery rhymes from the beginner book. She played that song. The complicated, fast, intense piece she had heard in the movie. Her playing wasn't perfect. In fact, it was messy. She missed notes constantly. Her timing was all over the place. But she played it over and over again. She was teaching herself, not by reading the dots on the page, but by listening. She learned which fingers fit where to make the sound she wanted to hear. A week passed. And then it was time for the dreaded piano class again. The walk to the community center felt different this time. Sophie was still nervous, and her stomach still did flips when she thought about facing Mrs. Sterling, but her steps were a little faster. She felt like she was carrying a secret weapon in her pocket. When she walked into the music room, the atmosphere was buzzing. The spring showcase was only 2 weeks away. The annual concert was a big deal for Mrs. Sterling. She invited local music critics, school principals, and parents to watch. It was the one night a year where she could show off her best students to prove what a great teacher she was. The room was decorated slightly differently. There was a banner on the wall that said Spring Showcase, Excellence in Music. Mrs. Sterling was standing in the front of the room, looking even sterner than usual. She was holding a stack of papers, and she was handing them out to the students one by one. "These are your performance assignments," Mrs. Sterling announced as the students settled into their seats. "I have chosen pieces that best suit your current abilities. Do not deviate from this list. I will not accept any changes." She walked down the row of older students. Thomas, the boy who had played the stormy piece last week, received a thick booklet of music. A Mozart sonata, Mrs. Sterling told him. "Technique must be flawless, Thomas." Thomas nodded, looking serious. Next. A girl named Jessica received a classical piece by Bach. Mrs. Sterling gave her a warning about keeping her wrists high. Then she moved on to a boy named David, assigning him a waltz. Every student was given a piece of music that looked complicated and impressive. The music sheets were covered in black notes, difficult and dense. Finally, Mrs. Sterling arrived in front of Sophie. The room went quiet. The other students turned to look at her. They were expecting her to get the simplest assignment, or perhaps to be told she wasn't in the show at all. Mrs. Sterling pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a booklet. It was one page with big, cartoonish notes on it. She handed it to Sophie. Sophie looked down. It was hot cross buns. "Now, Sophie," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Since we have established that your technical skills are lacking, I have assigned you a piece that is appropriate for a beginner. It is a simple nursery rhyme. I expect you to memorize it. If you practice very, very hard, perhaps you can get through it without stopping. Do not try to add anything fancy. Just play the notes as they are written." A few of the older students giggled. David, the boy with the waltz, covered his mouth with his hand. Sophie looked at the paper. It was insulting. It was a song for toddlers, a song you learned with one finger in your first week of lessons. Mrs. Sterling was putting her on stage, in front of everyone, to play a baby song. She was deliberately setting her up to look like a fool again. "I'm not playing this," Sophie said. The words slipped out of her mouth before she even realized she was going to say them. The giggling in the room stopped instantly. It was so quiet that you could hear the hum of the lights again. Mrs. Sterling froze. She slowly turned her head to look at Sophie. She looked at her as if she had grown a second head. "Excuse me?" Mrs. Sterling asked, her voice dangerously low. Sophie's hands were shaking under the table, but she gripped the edge of her dress tight to steady them. She looked up at the teacher. "I said I'm not playing hot cross buns. I'm 7 years old. That's a song for babies. I want to play something else." Mrs. Sterling took a step closer, looming over the small girl. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You will play what I give you, Sophie. You are in my class. You follow my rules. You are not good enough to play anything else. If you try to play something above your level, you will embarrass yourself, and you will embarrass this class." "I won't embarrass the class," Sophie said. Her voice was shaking, but it was clear. "I've been practicing. I can play the piece from the movie, the fast one. I know I can do it." The other students started to whisper. "Is she crazy?" Thomas whispered to David. "She can't even play a scale." Mrs. Sterling let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a laugh of pure disbelief. "The movie piece? You mean the list arrangement? That music is for virtuosos, Sophie. Professionals struggle with that piece. You think you can play it because you banged on your keys at home for a few days?" "I can do it," Sophie insisted. She felt her face getting hot, but she didn't back down. "No, you can't," Mrs. Sterling snapped. She grabbed the hot cross buns paper and slapped it back onto the music stand in front of Sophie. "You are suffering from a delusion of grandeur, little girl. You have no talent. You have no technique. You are a mediocre beginner, trying to act like a star." She leaned down, her face inches away from Sophie's. Her eyes were cold and hard. "You will play hot cross buns, or you will not play at all. If you refuse to play your assigned piece, I will cross your name off the program right now." Sophie looked at the paper. Then she looked at Mrs. Sterling. She knew the teacher was waiting for her to cry. She was waiting for her to crumble and apologize. But Sophie remembered the feeling of the piano keys under her fingers the other night. She remembered the power she felt when she played the difficult song. Sophie slowly picked up the hot cross buns sheet. She looked at it for a second, then tore it in half. The sound of the paper tearing was loud in the silent room. Mrs. Sterling's eyes went wide. "I won't play your song," Sophie said, her voice trembling but firm. "And if you won't let me play the other one, then I guess I'm off the program." She slid off the bench and stood up. She was shaking all over, terrified by what she had just done, but she also felt lighter. She walked past Mrs. Sterling, ignoring the gasps from the other students, and went to the back of the room. "You will regret this," Mrs. Sterling called after her, her voice shaking with anger. "You are throwing away the only chance you have. Don't come crying to me when you fail." Sophie sat in the back corner, ignoring everyone. She didn't care if she was off the program officially. She knew something Mrs. Sterling didn't. And when she got there, she wasn't going to play hot cross buns. She was going to play the music that was inside her. The week leading up to the showcase was a blur of tension and quiet determination for Sophie. She had officially been removed from the program. Mrs. Sterling had sent a note home with her a short, curt letter informing her parents that due to disruptive behavior and a refusal to follow the curriculum, Sophie would not be performing. Her parents were confused, but Sophie told them everything. She told them about the hot cross buns assignment, about the mocking, and about the other piece she wanted to play. Her parents sat her down in the living room. They looked at each other with worried expressions. "Sophie," her father said gently, "Mrs. Sterling is the expert. If she says you aren't ready for a hard song, maybe you should listen. We don't want you to go up there and have a bad experience." "I won't have a bad experience," Sophie insisted. "I know I can do it. Please, just let me try. If I mess up, I mess up. But I have to try." Her mother looked at her for a long time. She saw the fire in her daughter's eyes. She saw that this wasn't just about playing a song. It was about standing up for herself. Finally, her mother nodded. "Okay," she said. "We will talk to the organizers. Even if Mrs. Sterling doesn't put you on the list, you can still go. If there is a break or an open slot, you can play." The night of the showcase arrived. The community center was packed. The auditorium was filled with rows of folding chairs, and every single one of them was occupied. Parents held video cameras and bouquets of flowers. The air smelled of hairspray, perfume, and nervous anticipation. Backstage, in the small room that served as a holding area, the mood was chaotic. Students were rushing around, fixing their ties, adjusting their dresses, and frantically flipping through sheet music. Mrs. Sterling was in her element. She was marching back and forth, barking orders. "Jessica, stand up straight. You look like a question mark. Thomas, I told you to trim your fingernails." They are clicking on the keys. She was high on stress and adrenaline. She wanted this night to be perfect. She wanted to prove that her studio was the best in the district. Sophie stood near the door in her blue dress. She had no number. She had no place in the lineup. She just stood there, holding her music book under her arm, watching. She felt like an intruder. As Mrs. Sterling passed by, she stopped and looked at Sophie. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. "I told you, you are not in the show. Go sit in the audience with your parents." "I'm waiting for my turn," Sophie said calmly. She was surprised by how steady her voice was. Mrs. Sterling laughed, shaking her head in disbelief. "There is no turn for you. The program is full. We have serious musicians performing tonight, not children playing games. Go away before you embarrass me in front of the guests." She turned her back on Sophie and walked over to her star pupil, Thomas. "Remember," she told him, loud enough for everyone to hear, "precision separates the musicians from the noise. Some people are just born to be listeners, not performers." She glanced sideways at Sophie as she said it. A few of the other students heard it. They looked at Sophie with pity or smugness. David, the boy with the waltz, whispered to Thomas, "She thinks she's going to play. It's going to be a disaster." Sophie gripped her book tighter. She wanted to run out of the room. The mocking was getting to her. The reality of the situation was setting in. She wasn't on the list. The curtains weren't going to open for her. But just then, her father appeared at the door. He had been talking to the man running the soundboard. He beckoned Sophie over. Sophie walked over to him, leaving the circle of students. "I talked to them," her father whispered, bending down. "They have a 10-minute intermission planned after the first half of the show. They said you can go on then. It's not an official slot, but they will let you play if you want." Sophie felt a jolt of electricity shoot through her body. "I want to," she said immediately. "Okay," her father said, squeezing her shoulder. "Go get ready. You're on." The show started. The curtain opened, and the applause began. Sophie stood in the wings, hidden in the shadows, watching. She listened as the students played one by one. Some were good, some were okay. She could hear the nervousness in their playing. She could hear the mistakes they tried to hide. When Thomas walked out for the Mozart Sonata, Mrs. Sterling stood in the wings right next to Sophie. Her arms crossed, her eyes glued to the stage. Sophie could feel the energy radiating off her teacher. Mrs. Sterling wanted Thomas to be perfect, and he was good, very good. He played fast and clean. The audience loved it. Sophie clapped politely, but she wasn't intimidated. She just watched. The first half of the show ended. The house lights came up, and the buzz of conversation filled the room. The intermission had begun. Mrs. Sterling gathered her students around her, giving them a pep talk for the second half. "Excellent work so far," she said, looking pleased. "Keep your focus. Don't let the crowd distract you." 8. She didn't even notice Sophie slip away. Sophie walked out onto the stage. The auditorium was half empty as people stretched their legs and went to the bathroom. It felt enormous. The piano sat in the center of the stage, looking lonely under the single spotlight. Sophie sat down on the bench. Her feet didn't reach the pedals. She adjusted the height of the bench as much as she could. She looked out at the rows of empty seats and the people milling about in the back. For a second, panic grabbed her throat. What if they didn't listen? What if they talked over her? What if she forgot the song? But then she saw her father standing in the side aisle. He gave her a thumbs up. He believed in her. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She remembered the night in the living room. She remembered the feeling of the music. She wasn't playing for Mrs. Sterling anymore. She wasn't playing to prove a point. She was playing because she loved it. She placed her hands on the keys. The chatter in the room was loud. People were laughing and talking. Sophie didn't wait for silence. She didn't wait for permission. She just played the first chord. It was a loud, crashing chord that cut through the noise like a knife. The people closest to the stage stopped talking. They turned to look at the little girl in the blue dress. The sound that came next wasn't a simple nursery rhyme. It was a cascade of notes, fast and furious, tumbling down the keyboard like a waterfall. The room went quiet. It wasn't a forced silence. It was a silence of surprise. The people in the back stopped walking. The ushers froze. The music was pouring out of the piano, filling the huge hall. It was complex, emotional, and loud. Sophie's fingers were flying. She wasn't reading music. She was looking at her hands, but her eyes were unfocused, looking inside herself. She was swaying, her body moving with the rhythm, her small feet pumping in the air, even though they couldn't reach the pedals. In the wings, Mrs. Sterling had heard the music start. She frowned, confused. That wasn't on the program. She walked to the edge of the curtain to see who was playing. She expected to see a substitute performer or a parent fooling around. When she saw the small figure on the bench, she saw the blue dress. She saw the dangling feet. She saw Sophie. She walked out onto the stage, fully visible to the audience, intending to stop this madness. She was going to pull Sophie off the bench and scold her for ruining the intermission. But as she got closer, she stopped. She heard the intricacy of the melody. She heard the power in the left hand. She saw the concentration on Sophie's face. This wasn't the clumsy girl from the evaluation. This was something else entirely. Mrs. Sterling stood there, frozen in the middle of the stage, just a few feet behind the piano. The audience was watching the teacher now, watching her reaction. Mrs. Sterling's face went pale. For the first time in years, she didn't know what to do. She just listened. The sound that filled the auditorium was not just music. It was a storm. Sophie's small hands moved across the keys with a speed that blurred in the spotlight. She was playing the difficult piece, the one Mrs. Sterling had said was impossible for a child. The notes were complex and tangled, weaving together a melody that was at times angry and at times incredibly sad. The audience, which had been noisy and distracted just moments before, was now completely spellbound. People who had been halfway to the bathroom stopped in their tracks and turned around. Parents who had been scrolling on their phones lowered their devices. The ushers near the doors leaned forward, their mouths open slightly. No one could believe that this sound was coming from a 7-year-old girl, whose feet couldn't even reach the floor. Sophie wasn't thinking about the crowd. She wasn't thinking about the notes or the technical rules she had been taught. She had let go of all of that. She was playing purely on emotion. She remembered the feeling of being told she was nothing. She remembered the humiliation of being laughed at. She poured all of that frustration into the keys. When the music demanded power, she slammed her hands down, making the piano vibrate against the floor. When it demanded softness, she caressed the keys with a gentleness that made the room hold its breath, standing in the wings. The other students were frozen. Thomas, the star pupil, was watching with his mouth slightly open. He looked down at his own hands, then back at Sophie. He knew the piece she was playing. He knew how hard it was. He had tried to play a simplified version of it once, and failed. Seeing this little girl who had been ridiculed for playing hot cross buns tear through it like a professional was shocking. He looked at Mrs. Sterling's favorite students, and they all had the same look on their faces. Confusion, mixed with awe. But the most dramatic change was happening center. Mrs. Sterling had walked out, intending to stop the performance. She had taken 3 steps onto the stage, her arm raised to signal the curtains closed. But the music hit her like a physical force. It stopped her in her tracks. As she stood there, listening, the anger on her face began to melt away. Her eyebrows, which had been furrowed in a permanent scowl, slowly raised. Her mouth opened just a little. She was a musician. She knew the difference between a student hitting notes and a true artist playing with soul. She had always told her students that technique was everything, that precision was the only thing that mattered. But Sophie was making mistakes. She was missing a trill here, rushing a passage there. Yet the emotion was so powerful, the energy so raw, that the mistakes didn't matter. In fact, the music sounded better because of the passion behind it. It sounded alive. Mrs. Sterling lowered her arm. She stood there, paralyzed by the realization that she had been wrong. She looked at Sophie, really looked at her, not as a problem student, but as a child with a rare and incredible gift. A gift that Mrs. Sterling had almost crushed out of her. She couldn't see past her own rigid rules. The song was reaching its climax. The music built up, faster and faster, the notes cascading like a waterfall, crashing onto rocks. Sophie's hair was falling out of its clips, sticking to her sweaty forehead. Her dress was wrinkled from leaning over the keys. She didn't look like the perfect, polished student Mrs. Sterling wanted. She looked like a wild, untamed genius. And then, suddenly, she hit the final chord. She brought both hands down hard on the keys, creating a loud, resonant sound that seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. She held her hands there, pressing the keys down, letting the sound vibrate through the wood and into her bones. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the auditorium. It was a heavy, thick silence. No one breathed. Everyone was just staring at the small girl on the bench, trying to process what they had just heard. Slowly, Sophie lifted her hands. She took a deep breath, her chest heaving. She smoothed down her dress and pushed her hair out of her eyes. She turned around on the bench to face the audience. That was when the noise exploded. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar. The entire audience stood up as one. People were cheering, whistling, and shouting bravo. A man in the front row was wiping tears from his eyes. Sophie's father was clapping so hard his hands were red. A huge grin on his face, Sophie looked out at the sea of people blinking in the bright spotlight. A shy smile appeared on her face. She stood up on the bench so she could be seen and gave a small, awkward curtsy. The applause got even louder. Slowly, the noise began to penetrate Mrs. Sterling's shock. She looked around at the standing ovation, then back at Sophie. She felt a strange sensation in her chest regret. She realized that she had nearly silenced this voice. She had tried to force a square peg into a round hole. If Sophie had listened to her, if she had played hot cross buns, this moment never would have happened. The applause started to die down slightly as the audience began to settle. Mrs. Sterling knew she had to do something. She was the teacher. This was her studio. She couldn't just stand there like a statue. She walked slowly toward the piano. Sophie saw her coming. For a second, the fear came back into her eyes. She thought Mrs. Sterling was going to scold her. She thought the teacher was going to grab her arm and drag her off stage for playing without permission. The room went quiet again, waiting to see what would happen. Mrs. Sterling reached the piano. She looked down at Sophie. The audience held its breath. Mrs. Sterling didn't yell. Instead, she leaned down and whispered something into Sophie's ear. "I was wrong," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice trembling slightly. "You are not noise. You are music." Sophie's eyes went wide. Mrs. Sterling straightened up. She turned to face the audience. She gestured for Sophie to stay on the bench. Mrs. Sterling took the microphone that was sitting on the piano. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice echoing through the hall, "there seems to have been a mistake with the program. I told you earlier that some people are born to be listeners. I was mistaken. This young lady is not a listener. She is a performer, and I am sorry to say, she is no longer my student." A murmur of confusion went through the crowd. Mrs. Sterling continued, "Because a teacher who almost destroyed a talent like this does not deserve to have her as a student. Sophie, you are too good for my class. You don't need lessons on discipline. You need freedom. Please play one more for us." Mrs. Sterling stepped away from the microphone and sat down on the bench next to Sophie. She didn't play. She just sat there, turning the pages of the imaginary sheet music in her head, letting Sophie take the lead. Sophie looked at Mrs. Sterling, and then she looked at her father in the audience. She knew she didn't have to play to prove herself anymore. She had already done that, but she wanted to. She put her hands back on the keys and began to play again. This time, it wasn't a storm. It was a soft, beautiful melody. As she played, Mrs. Sterling sat beside her, and for the first time, the teacher wasn't thinking about rules or posture. She was just listening, finally understanding what music was really supposed to be.